All right, tonight we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be stepping back in time, to World War II London, and more specifically, we're going to be talking about London under the blackout. You sent us a really fascinating audio source that kind of brings that whole era to life, and we're going to be talking about a killer who really used the cover of darkness to his advantage.
Yeah, the blackouts are just such a fascinating aspect of this era. I mean, every single night, London was plunged into total darkness to make it harder for German bombers to find their targets. Obviously, a necessary safety measure at the time, but it created a whole host of new problems.
Absolutely. And the source you gave us does a really good job of, bringing that to life, like just how difficult it was to even navigate the streets, dim street lights, the traffic lights were covered. People were just kind of stumbling around with these very limited flashlights. And everywhere you looked, there were sandbags and bomb shelters. But the thing that pervades the whole thing is the sense of just like overwhelming fear.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it would have been utterly terrifying. I mean, just the constant threat of, bombs raining down from the sky. And then you add to that this layer of darkness and uncertainty. It's a recipe for real anxiety.
Totally. And, that fear, that disruption of just normal life, it's like you said, it creates this opportunity for someone like Gordon Cummins, the RAF cadet who became known as the Blackout Ripper.
Exactly. And that's really what we're going to try to unpack tonight. Like, how did this seemingly ordinary airman become a brutal murderer?
And is it possible that he was responsible for even more deaths than those he was convicted of?
Those are the big questions, right? But
Yeah.
before we get into the specifics of Cummins' crimes, it's really important to understand the world he was operating in. Like, London under the blackout wasn't just dark. It was a city transformed.
Yeah, and I think the source also does a good job of highlighting how the blackout, it wasn't just like, oh, it's dark now. It really took a toll on people's morale and was very disruptive. It confined people to their homes. Their social lives were, completely upended. There was this constant sense of unease.
Oh, absolutely. It
Yeah.
definitely created this kind of breeding ground for all sorts of criminal activity.
Yeah.
People were on edge, desperate times, call for desperate measures, as they say.
Right, so let's talk about the victims, the women who tragically crossed paths with the Blackout Ripper. There are 6 confirmed victims: Evelyn Hamilton, Evelyn Oatley, Patricia Borg, Catherine Malkay Doris, Joanna and Margaret Lowe.
Yeah, and what's striking about those victims is that they were all attacked during the blackout, and most of them were sex workers, which really speaks to the vulnerability of women during wartime.
Absolutely. Prostitution, already a dangerous profession, was made even more so by the blackout. These women were operating on the fringes of society, and the darkness provided a cloak of anonymity for both them and their attacker.
Right, it's like something meant to protect the city inadvertently made certain people even more vulnerable.
Totally. And then to add another layer to that, there are 2 other possible victims, right? Maple Church and Edith Humphrey. Their murders were never officially linked to Cummins, but there are some disturbing similarities.
Yeah, I mean, the timing of their deaths, the brutality of the attacks, the locations where they were found, all of these things align with Cummins' known crimes.
So it's like, was Scotland Yard dealing with a killer who was just getting started?
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? And it really makes you wonder how many other cases might be out there that were never connected to him.
Okay, so let's talk about Gordon Cummins himself. I mean, he was an RAF cadet, a respected member of the Royal Air Force, intelligent, physically capable, even charming. And he had a wife who actually staunchly defended his innocence throughout the whole ordeal.
Yeah, but there's this dark side to him too, right? He was known to frequent sex workers, and he actually bragged about his conquests. So you have this real contradiction, the respectable airman and then the brutal killer.
Right, how can somebody live this double life?
And how on earth did the police finally catch up to him and connect him to these horrific crimes?
Yeah, because it sounds like he was living this very compartmentalized life.
Yeah.
Upstanding citizen by day, and then something else entirely under the cover of darkness.
Well, their investigation was incredibly thorough, and it started with a seemingly insignificant detail: fingerprints. They found his fingerprints at one of the crime scenes on a can opener and a piece of glass.
Wow, so he just left his fingerprints out in the open. That seems kind of careless for a serial killer, don't you think?
You would think, right?
Yeah.
It's almost as if he knew about forensic techniques, but was overconfident in his ability to cover his tracks. But that wasn't the only evidence they found.
Okay, so what else did they find?
Well, they also discovered an RAF haversack with a service number on it at the scene of an attempted murder.
Wait, so a haversack is like a military bag, right? Like something an RAF cadet would carry?
Exactly. It was a huge breakthrough for the investigation and a pretty hard piece of evidence to explain away.
So at that point, are they like, okay, we got him?
Well, not quite.
Yeah.
The evidence kept piling up. They found personal items belonging to the victims in his possession, and then there were bloodstains on his clothing. It all pointed to Cummins, and yet throughout the investigation and even during his trial, he just maintained his innocence.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
So, with all of this evidence stacked against him, how did he possibly think he could get away with it?
It's baffling, isn't it? And it really raises the question of what could drive a seemingly ordinary man to commit such brutal acts.
Mm.
I mean, was he just a master manipulator hiding his true nature?
Was there some kind of trigger that unleashed these violent urges? I mean, these are all questions that we're going to keep exploring as we delve deeper into the life and crimes of the Blackout Ripper. But first, let's take a closer look at the impact his crimes had on wartime London. I mean, you've got to imagine that people were already on edge with everything else going on.
Absolutely. The Blackout Ripper added a whole new layer of fear and anxiety to an already incredibly tense situation.
It's crazy to think people had to deal with a serial killer on the loose on top of everything else going on in London during the war.
Oh, yeah. The impact was huge. I mean, people were already on edge with, nightly bombing raids and rationing the constant threat of invasion. And then you throw in a serial killer or someone preying on women in the darkness. It just amplified that existing anxiety to unbearable levels.
It's like a nightmare, honestly. The source we've been looking at, actually, kind of the area where most of the murders took place, at the Mile of Terror. I mean, can you imagine?
Oh, yeah. The blackout that was meant to protect London from the bombers, it actually created this perfect hunting ground for this predator. And the fact that so many of his victims were sex workers, too, it just added another layer of fear and uncertainty.
Why is that?
Well, it kind of tapped into these really deep-seated anxieties,
Yeah.
about female vulnerability and the dangers lurking in the shadows. I mean, remember, London already had the whole Jack the Ripper thing back in the late
Oh.
1800s.
Oh, right.
So it's almost like history repeating itself, these echoes of unsolved crimes from the past.
So it's not just the darkness itself, but this whole feeling of like, oh no, not this again.
Exactly. And we also have to remember that forensic science was still in its early stages back then. So the police didn't have the tools and techniques we have today, like DNA analysis, for example. They were relying on much more rudimentary methods like fingerprinting and blood typing.
And even with those limitations, they still managed to build a pretty strong case against Cummins. We talked earlier about the RAF haversack and the fingerprints, but there's this one detail that always gives me chills. The source mentions that he altered the logbook at the aircrew receiving center.
Right. By changing the logbook, he created this false alibi for himself for the night of one of the murders. It shows a level of premeditation and cunning that's pretty disturbing.
It's also just arrogant, don't you think? Like he thought he was smarter than everyone else.
Yeah, maybe. Or maybe it was just desperation, a
Yeah.
last-ditch effort to escape what he'd done, whatever his motives were. It obviously backfired.
Okay, so let's get back to those lingering questions about Cummins' possible involvement in the deaths of Maple Church and Edith Humphrey.
Right, these cases are super interesting because they happened just a few months before his confirmed spree began, and the similarities are striking: the brutality, the locations, the fact that both women were found with their belongings missing, suggesting robbery as a possible motive.
So Scotland Yard suspected Cummins was responsible, but they couldn't definitively link him to the crimes. It's so frustrating to think he might have gotten away with 2 more murders.
It is, and it highlights the limitations of criminal investigations, especially during wartime. I mean, imagine the chaos and upheaval of the Blitz, the sheer volume of cases the police were dealing with. It's not hard to imagine that some crucial evidence might have been lost or overlooked.
So we have all these unanswered questions surrounding Cummins and these 2 potential victims whose deaths might never be fully explained. But let's shift gears for a second and talk about what happened after his arrest, what happened to Cummins, and how did London react.
Well, even though he maintained his innocence throughout the trial, he was found guilty based on the mountain of evidence against him.
What about his family? Did they finally accept his guilt?
Not really. The source says his family, especially his wife, they continued to believe in his innocence even after the conviction. They even started a petition for his release and got thousands of signatures.
Wow, that's incredible. Even with all the evidence, people can still hold on to those beliefs, especially when it comes to someone they love.
Yeah, it's the power of denial and the bonds of family loyalty. It reminds us that even the worst crimes don't just impact the victims and their families, but the perpetrators' loved ones too.
So what happened to Cummins in the end?
He was hanged in June of 1942, and the source actually mentions a really chilling detail. His execution happened at the same time as air raid sirens were going off over London.
Oh, wow, that's a haunting image. It's a reminder that even in the middle of war, justice, or at least some form of it, was still being pursued.
It also reminds us that the darkness that Cummins embodied wasn't something unique to him. It reflected a kind of broader societal darkness that was magnified by the war.
And after they caught him, did London finally breathe a sigh of relief?
The source says yes. The fear started to dissipate, and people could focus on the more immediate threat of the Blitz. But the shadow of the Blackout Ripper definitely lingered. His crimes became part of London's wartime lore, a reminder of the darkness that can hide even in the most civilized society.
You know, it's amazing how much this one case, the story of the Blackout Ripper, really tells us about London during World War II.
Yeah, it's like looking into this dark mirror that reflects all the anxieties and vulnerabilities of a city under siege.
We've talked about the impact of the blackouts, the psychology of a serial killer, those echoes of past crimes that just haunted Londoners during this time. But it feels like we still have so many unanswered questions.
Well, that's the nature of these kinds of things, right? Some mysteries we might never fully solve.
Like those two possible victims, Maple Church and Edith Humphrey, will we ever know for sure if Cummins was the one who killed them?
It's possible, right? Maybe new evidence will come to light, but it's also possible that we'll just never have a definitive answer. And that uncertainty, that lack of closure, it's something that a lot of people who've been touched by violent crime unfortunately have to live with.
It's a tough thing to think about. So, for our listener tuning in today, why should we care about a case that happened over 80 years ago?
Well, I think the themes of this case are really timeless,
Yeah.
right? This idea that darkness can exist in seemingly ordinary people, the way that, societal upheaval can create opportunities for violence, and this idea that understanding the past can help us make sense of the present.
We can't just ignore the darkness or pretend it doesn't exist, right? We have to learn from it.
Exactly. Knowledge is power. The more we understand about what makes people pick, what leads to violence, and how we can create safer communities, the better off we'll all be.
In this case, really highlights how important forensic science is, too. Even back then, think about those fingerprints on the can opener, the RAF haversack. Those tiny details helped bring Cummins to justice.
Oh, absolutely. And forensic science has come such a long way since the 1940s. Imagine what investigators could do with the tools we have now: DNA analysis, advanced fingerprinting, crime scene reconstruction. I mean, who knows? Maybe Cummins would have been caught even sooner, or maybe he could have gone on for longer.
That's a scary thought, but it also makes you appreciate how far we've come in understanding these things.
Yeah, we still have a long way to go, but it's important to acknowledge the progress we've made.
So where do we go from here? What can our listener take away from all of this?
I'd say the most important takeaway is just to stay informed, be aware of the fact that anyone is capable of anything, and to understand the things that can contribute to violence, but it's also a call to action. Be an engaged citizen, support policies that promote safety and justice, and support organizations that are working to prevent violence.
The Blackout Ripper might be a figure from the past, but the lessons we can learn from his case are still relevant today.
We may never fully understand what drove Gordon Cummins to do what he did, but by exploring his story, we're kind of staring into that darkness. We can learn a lot about ourselves and the world we live in.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up our deep dive into the Blackout Ripper case. But we really encourage you to keep exploring the story. There are tons of books, articles, documentaries out there. Do your own research, come to your own conclusions, and most importantly, never stop asking questions.